The Lord has revealed to the nations his saving power. This was our response today, and we sang it with gusto. And as we know, the Hebrew word for nations also means Gentiles, which gives this response a slightly different tone. The Lord reveals to the Gentiles his saving power. And the Gentiles were all those who were non-Jewish, all the nations. But the psalmist is saying basically that the Lord has revealed to the whole world outside his saving power. And we'll also take note that the psalmist doesn't say the Lord has revealed to the Gentiles his healing power, although there is definitely healings in today's readings, but rather saving power. Following the Lucan theme that we've seen pop up from time to time throughout this series is the teaching that the community that they loved, but they were separated from God. They could no longer go into the temple, the very presence of God in the Holy of Holies in their midst. They were among the living dead. And the book of Leviticus says, if by some chance you are healed, go and show yourself to the Old Testament priests, and they can declare you clean. That's what Jesus is doing in today's gospel passage. The Saint Ephraim sees in Naaman a prefigurement of what we receive in baptism. Naaman sort of fought the prophet. The prophet didn't even see him at first. The prophet sends a servant to let Naaman know that he should go dunk himself 7 times in the Jordan River. And Naaman's thinking to himself, we got cleaner water back home. You want me to go in that dirty water? And he's reminded, if the prophet had told him to do something difficult, he would do it. How much more so should he do what the prophet says? And so Naaman puts his faith in the word of the prophet Elijah, a prophet of God. And he's made like a newborn babe. His skin is cleansed. He is made whole. He receives healing from God. But it doesn't stop there for Naaman. He has a conversion experience. He recognizes where his healing comes from. Yes, he was healed, but he received even the greater gift of salvation. From now on, he promises, no longer will I offer holocausts and sacrifices to pagan gods, but I will offer sacrifice to the Lord. He receives salvation. That's what our gospel is pointing to today. 10. In conformity with the book of Leviticus, they were to keep their distance, and they do. Unlike the book of Leviticus, where they're to cry out, unclean, unclean. In an act of desperation, they say, Jesus, Master, have pity on us. And Jesus follows the dictates of the old law to reveal a greater glory. Go show yourselves to the Old Testament priests, and they will declare you clean. Remember, Jesus didn't heal them at that moment. He asked them to trust, to have faith. And so they begin the journey to Jerusalem, still limping and hurting inside, the pains, the sores on their bodies. But somewhere along their journey, that long journey to Jerusalem, they began to feel better. Their skin was cleansed, no longer limping and in pain and agony. The Samaritan, the outsider, the last, recognized where his healing came from. It was a gift of God. God was doing something unheard of, new in their midst. And he returns to Jesus, and he gives Jesus the homage that is due to God, just as we fall on our knees in the Eucharistic prayer, in the very presence of our God. So the Samaritan falls to his knees and is the first in the New Testament to thank Jesus personally. The Greek word used for thanksgiving is the same word that we use, Eucharist, thanksgiving. We have 3 stories of healing. Haven't talked about Paul yet, but he's coming. 3 stories of healing. Healing in the Old Testament, where an outsider, a Gentile, experiences the saving power of God and becomes a member of God's chosen people. We have in the New Testament, in the ministry of Jesus, a Samaritan, an outsider, experiencing the healing power of God and then experiencing the saving power of God. And in foretaste, Eucharist, communion with God as he kneels in the presence of the Word made flesh. St. Paul was an outsider. Not outside the Jewish community, but outside the Christian community. St. Paul was an enemy of the church. He persecuted the church. And yet St. Paul experiences healing. His eyes are open to the truth. And as a bishop of the church, a bishop to the Gentiles, he offers thanksgiving, Eucharist. He leads the community. In this New Testament time, St. Paul is an example to us of what happens when we give thanks to God, not simply for physical healings, but more importantly for the salvation that comes in Christ. St. Paul, in giving thanksgiving and offering the Eucharist, is conformed to Christ. In today's reading, he speaks of his suffering in communion with Christ. And that suffering is salvation. It is salvific for those who encounter him. Last week, he told people Timothy not to be ashamed of his suffering. Because we see in that suffering the suffering of Christ. In our catechism, in paragraph 1115, St. Leo the Great, my patron, is quoted in reference to the miracles of Jesus. What is visible in the ministry of Jesus is passed over to the mysteries of the church. That Greek word, which in the Latin is the sacraments. The sacraments. Just as St. Ephraim saw in Naaman, a precursor to baptism, so St. John Chrysostom sees in the Samaritan the precursor to our sacrament of reconciliation, where we are sent to the priest, where the priest, through the words of absolution, gives the penitent not only healing, spiritual healing, but the salvation that comes in communion with Christ. It takes faith. Naaman had faith. Struggled for a moment, but had faith. The Samaritan had faith. His eyes were open to the reality of what God was doing in his midst. What about the other 9? Were they like Naaman before he placed his trust in the words of the prophet? Did they think that the sacrament of reconciliation is too humdrum, too ordinary? Can't I just ask God to forgive me wherever I am? Did they forget on the journey how incredible the healing they received was? No doubt, they were reconciled to the community. But God was doing something new in their midst. And like so many others in the days of Jesus, like so many others in the world today, they were blind to the reality of where salvation truly comes. It comes through His Word, the Word made flesh in our midst, through the sacraments, where Christ continues to act in our midst. Think to yourself. Take time to meditate this week on your life. Things you prayed for 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. Have you been healed of those things? Redeemed from those things? Have we given thanks? Given Eucharistic praise to God? The Lord has revealed to the Gentiles, to the nations, His saving power. May the Lord open our eyes to the miracles taking place here.